The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. The first thing to say about this is that it's unlike the other texts in your Edexcel anthology because it's a speech. So we need to look at that when we're talking about the form and structure of the text. So it was initially delivered as a TED Talk. She probably wrote it first, and then she's speaking it, and what you're now looking at is a written version of what she spoke. Okay, but we need to look at what are the features of it in terms of the form and structure and in terms of the style that are there because it was originally spoken. It's a first-person recount of her experiences growing up. She talks about growing up in Nigeria, and she recounts lots of anecdotes and experiences through her life, but it's to do with how she develops as a writer and as a reader, and that's interlaced with reflections on how her reading experience influenced her perspective on the world, and how actually that happens for all of us. What we read, what we're exposed to in terms of the books that we read and the media that we're exposed to, how that influences the way that we see the world and see ourselves and see others. She starts off with this really short sentence, "I'm a storyteller." And one of the things you could talk about is just the impact of that really short sentence to start off with. I think it acts as an engaging hook to you as a listener or as a reader, because we all like stories, don't we? We like listening to people who can tell stories and entertain us and keep us gripped. And so when she starts off by saying, "I'm a storyteller," to me it's almost like as if you settle down and you sit back in your chair and think, "Oh, okay, I'm going to look forward to this. This is going to be great." The oral context of the delivery, what I'm saying is that she was initially speaking this, that it's primarily therefore a spoken text. Yes, okay, it was probably written first and then she's speaking it, but the context of the reception, so the context of her standing there in an auditorium delivering a TED Talk to probably hundreds of people, that influenced the style and the structure, okay? That's why, for instance, one of the things is, if you look at it, there are quite a lot of sentences that begin with coordinating conjunctions. So the words and, but, so are coordinating conjunctions. Usually we use them to join the sentences together. When we're speaking, we use a lot more coordinating conjunctions than when we're writing. Okay, and so it's possible that when she originally wrote it, she might not have had as many ands, buts and so's in there, but as she's speaking it, she's automatically including those, or maybe she consciously put them in there when she was writing to make it sound like a speech, I don't know. But she's including those to create that sense of fluency, to create that sense of spontaneity. Another example of that is the use of the word now. So if you look, for instance, she uses the word now a couple of times, and I would call that a colloquial discourse marker. It's the kind of thing that we do when we're speaking. We just insert the word now just to show we're moving on to the next idea, to the next point. An example of that is on line 11, for instance. So she's just been talking about how the books that she read that were written in Britain and America often spoke about how lovely it was that the sun came out. And then she says, "Now despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria." I'd never been outside Nigeria. And that now, it's just a kind of casual, informal, spontaneous, speech-like insertion of the word, which just makes the whole thing seem that little bit more natural and chatty and fluent. Another example of that is on line 24. So she says, "Now I loved those American and British books I read." Can you see that now? It's just a bit like saying well or so. It's just the kind of introduction to a sentence that we often use when we're speaking. Finally, in terms of it being like a speech, it's worth looking at how she ends her speech. So she ends it with this metaphor all about regaining a kind of paradise. So she says, in that last paragraph, she says, "I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise." And that paradise image, to me, it suggests this idea of the limitlessness of perspective, that when we reject the idea of a single story, when we have a determination to not just have be narrow-minded about what someone is like, when we refuse to look at them in just one way, or just the way that the media has presented them, or the way that someone else has presented them to us, when we are determined to be open-minded and consider that any one individual or group of people has so many different aspects and facets to their lives, okay, that actually is exciting, because it creates this sense that, well, there are endless possibilities, you know, that any one person or a group of people, that their lives and their experiences and what they've got to offer the world is incredibly, infinitely rich. Do you know what I mean? And that lack of constraint is really liberating and exciting. I think that's what she means by that. But the point here that we can make is that to end with that image, okay, to say when we reject the idea of a single story, we regain a kind of paradise, to place that at the end, it forces you as a listener to go away and think about it. You know, you don't immediately know what she means by that. You have to go away and ponder that and think, oh, in what way? What does she mean by that? And so just as at the beginning she hooks you in with I'm a storyteller, okay, at the end what she does, I think, is deliberately leaves you with something to think about, to go away and to ponder yourself. Okay, so what's the message? Well, we've kind of touched on that already, but to me it's about the idea that the books that we read and the narratives that we're exposed to about others frame our perspective. They determine the way that we see them and ourselves. Okay, and I think what she's saying is that we need to be aware of the power of art and media and language to influence us, and we need to be determined to break free from that constraint. We need to be determined to look at anyone with an open mind, and to be aware that what we've read about them, what other people have said about them, the way that they've been presented on the media might have limited our perception of them, that there could be so many different aspects to them and their lives and their experiences that maybe we're not aware of. Yeah, we need to be determined to be open-minded in that sense. And what she does is she uses a series of narratives to demonstrate this. So if you look at it, there are three, I think. There's the story about Fide, who was the servant for her family when she was younger. And then they go to see his family, don't they? And she realizes that they make these incredible, beautiful baskets and so on. There's the story about her going to university in the United States. And then there's the story about her visiting Mexico. And what she's doing in each of those three instances is she's looking at this idea of influence. She looks at the influence of her parents on her when she was younger. So how did the way that her parents spoke of Fide, in terms of saying, they haven't got any food, representing him purely as someone who was poor, how did the way that her parents spoke of Fide influence the way that she saw him? Okay. Then she looks at the influence of mainstream American culture on her roommate, the idea that her roommate had this very narrow perspective on what she would be like, on the basis of her perception of Africa from American culture, from the media and so on. And then she also looks at the influence of the American media on her in terms of the way that she saw Mexico and Mexicans, having lived in America for some time. What she does then is she mocks others. So she mocks other people's perception of Nigeria and exposes how absurd, how ridiculous it is, and of Africa generally as well. Okay, but she doesn't just do that. She also makes a conscious effort to admit her own vulnerability, her own susceptibility to being influenced by the media and by what she's read, and that she herself has been guilty of what she also says happens to others. And she really focuses on this, I think. So if you look, for instance, on line 69, at one point she says, I was overwhelmed with shame. Okay, she's quite brutal and blunt and honest, isn't she? There's a blunt honesty about how she represents herself here. So what she's using self-deprecation. She's putting herself down to ensure that she positions herself. That just means she represents herself as someone who needs to hear her own message. And that, in doing so, what she does then is avoids the risk of being seen as patronizing or condemnatory. She doesn't just want to come across as someone who's kind of pointing the finger and saying, you white American people, you need to get your act together, okay? Or you rich Western people, you need to start looking at Africans in a different way. Okay, she's not doing that. She's saying, actually, we are all in danger of this, okay? And that makes, obviously, that makes the listener, the reader, more open to her message, because if you think that someone's patronizing you or condemning you, you immediately become very defensive, don't you? Whereas if you think that someone is admitting their own weaknesses and flaws and vulnerability and susceptibility to something, then you're far more likely to be accepting of what they've got to say. Okay, in terms of language, what kind of points can we make? Well, I think you can tell it's a speech, actually. Again, I think it kind of comes back to that. There's such a variation in the rhythm and the length of sentences. And sometimes she would just use these short sentences for effect. And an example of that would be that first sentence, I'm a storyteller. But then also, for instance, look at line 31. She's recounting the story of Fide. She says, and so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. And can you see that really short sentence there? It adds a bit of rhythm and variety to the sentence length, and it makes it easier to listen to. Okay. It also, perhaps, that short sentence, it kind of just focuses you on Fide and makes you think about him and get him in your mind. Maybe even by emphasizing his name, gives him a degree of dignity. Do you know what I mean? He's not just the houseboy, he's not just the servant, she's going to mention his name. Maybe it's that as well, I don't know. Another example would be on line 75, for instance, where she says, stories matter, full stop. Many stories matter, full stop. And those short sentences there, it's to emphasize her point. And in this case, the idea that we should make sure that we're not just exposed to one perspective on things. And the importance of narrative, the importance of storytelling, the importance of reading about others and their experiences, the power of literature and the spoken word as well. She's emphasizing all those ideas through the repetition and the really short sentences there. What else does she use? Well, she uses antithesis. Antithesis just means opposites, so contrasting ideas right next to each other. So can you see when she says, stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. So on the one hand, she's saying stories can be destructive and have a negative impact on people and the way others see them and the way they see themselves. Okay, but stories can also be creative and be powerful in healing. Yeah, and so it's this contrast between the destructive and the creative power of narrative. Okay. And if you look at it, those two clauses, those two chunks of that sentence, there's a parallelism there, yeah. So there's a repetition of sentence structure. Syntax, it just means word order. Okay, so syntactic parallelism just means repetition of clause structure. Okay, stories can break the dignity of a people. Stories can also repair that broken dignity. There's a repetition in terms of the way those clauses are built up. Yeah. Another example would be repetition of participles. So if you look when she talks about having gone to Mexico, she says, I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. And I think that the going, rolling, smoking, laughing, referring to the people there, it creates that sense of chaotic activity, doesn't it? There's a hustle and bustle. It's this place that's full of life and it's exciting and you want to be there just to watch people and get the atmosphere. Yeah. And so you could say that the repetition of the participles here, it's like she's celebrating this amazing place that's Mexico, that's so full of variety and life and so much more than the very limited, restricted, reductive view of Mexico that she had presented to her through the American media. And then finally, you could look, I think right at the end, it's quite powerful how she uses the first person plural pronoun we. Okay, look at the last couple of lines, the last paragraph. She says that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. And I think she's determined to use that word we there to say, I need to do it, you need to do it, we all need to do it together. It's a very inclusive pronoun to use. And again, it reinforces this idea that she's not being condemnatory. She's saying this is something that we need to tackle together. We need to join in combating this danger.